From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Could I urge people to sit and maybe sort of come in the middle more? The reason we're a bit slow getting going is that we had our press release said 4:30 for the beginning, and our internal publicity said 4. So we decided we'd better wait till 4:30 because people from the outside would have gotten that information. But I think we should now begin. I'm Pross Gifford, the Director of Scholarly Programs here at the library, and it's my pleasure to initiate this conversation with Judith Brown, who's a member of our Scholars Council, as well as the Beit Professor of Commonwealth History at Oxford, on her book published last year by the Yale Press on Nehru. I gather, talking to her, that the book is also now being sold by Oxford Press in an Indian edition. I've known Professor Brown many years before she joined the Scholars Council, because beginning in 1972, when I was still a fairly active Africanist, her doctoral dissertation was published by Cambridge Press, Gandhi's Rise to Power, Indian Politics, 1915-1922. I was, of course, familiar in those days with Gandhi's 21 South African years. Many people don't realize he spent 21 years in South Africa, where he really honed the techniques for satyagraha and the techniques he pursued later in politics in India. So I read that book, and I read the sequel, Gandhi and Civil Disobedience, The Mahatma in Indian Politics, 1928-1939. During these years, Professor Brown was at the University of Manchester, and she was still at Manchester when the Yale Press published her full-length biography of Gandhi, which was I think, a very splendid book, and I'm sure he led the Yale Press to the Nehru book. Having spent a number of years, probably 20 years, studying Gandhi, she then wrote a more general book about modern India in 1994, and co-edited with Roger Lewis the 4th volume of the new Oxford History of the British Empire. She was born in India, and those of you who had a chance to look at Nehru know that she mentions in the beginning of that she saw Nehru once close up when she was leaving India to become a Cambridge undergraduate, and he was on the same flight, same Air India flight, going to a Commonwealth meeting in London. And she remarks that she had occasion then to realize how much Indians revered Nehru. So we have somebody who has got India in her bones. As commentators, we have two people who are also real India hands. Granville Austin, whom I know as Red, and Ainsley Embry both know India at first hand. Dr. Austin has written 2 books on the Indian Constitution. This first one, which came out in '66 from Oxford in England originally, has gone through at least 7, maybe 8 editions in India on Indian paper, and is referred to often in India, even in the court system. And the second one, which is called Working a Democratic Constitution, came out in 1999. Ainsley Embry went to India originally. He's a native Canadian, but he went to India originally to teach in 1948 and stayed for 10 years. And thereafter returned, convinced that he wanted to study India. He became president eventually of the American Institute of Indian Studies. He was chairman of the Southern Asia Institute at Columbia for many years, and has written on the Hindu tradition, on India's search for national identity, and has edited the very important Encyclopedia of Asian History. So we're in the company of three people who really know India, a country, a subcontinent really, of tremendous importance to us, and I think not as well known by Americans as, say, either China or Japan. But that's our loss, and we hope to make up some of it today. So Judith, where are you? Yes.
Should I just be here to begin with? And then
We should have 3 seats. But
we should. I can stand.
well,
Are we ready? I think the plan is that I should speak briefly first, and then we will engage in conversation. Yes? Well, thank you all very much for coming, and I'm delighted to be here again, but particularly because this occasion gives me the chance to say a very big thank you to the Library of Congress, to Prosser Gifford, to the Kluge Center and all its staff for the years of kindness on visits here, and particularly for the invitation to spend 10 days a couple of years ago doing research here, when I was able to read in the magnificent reading room with the microfilm machines and engage with the American reporting of Nehru on his 3 visits here while he was Prime Minister. So, Prosser, thank you for this occasion, but for all the occasions previously, and for the many members, staff members, who I can see lurking, who I won't embarrass by naming. Why did I write this book? Well, at the most simplest level, I was asked, as you surmised, by Yale University Press, if I would write a biographical study of Nehru somewhat on the same lines as my book on Mahatma Gandhi. Because, of course, Nehru was supremely significant in the making of independent India, and there is really no single scholarly volume available on him which is based on recent archival research. Those of you who are historians know, of course, the great 3-volumed work on him by Dr. S. Gopal, which was published between 1975 and 1984. And in many ways, that still remains authoritative. As the son of the president, he had access to much material which was never available to later scholars. But there are great problems with that book. It is, of course, vast, and contemporary students at many levels often don't have the time or the inclination to read 3-volumed works. But also, it's purely chronological in approach and doesn't really give people without a knowledge of India a real way into understanding where Nehru fits in the subcontinent's history. So there was, as it were, a gap in the literature. A second reason is that I find Nehru a fascinating figure for India's own history and for world affairs. Now, like most figures who have been dominant in a generation, he's had a variable reputation, swinging from adulation to profound criticism, the latter being where we really are in India at the moment. But I've been interested in him beyond these ebbs and flows of opinion because, of course, he had for years after his return from South Africa a deep yet often tumultuous relationship with Gandhi. So really, all the time I've been working on Gandhi, I've also had insights into Nehru via the Gandhi relationship. And then the third reason for writing the book was that now there is available to some scholars at least a wealth of archival material to enable a serious research-based biographical study. Historians have been able to use Nehru's personal papers up to 1947, the date of independence, with very little trouble at all. But the post-1947 papers have been largely unused and have been carefully, access to them has been carefully controlled by the Nehru-Gandhi family. I think somewhat unwisely, because ultimately scholars will have to use them. And I was given permission, don't ask me why, but I was enabled to study them. And they are a magnificent resource. They give a view of the day-by-day working of Nehru as a prime minister. And in a way, there's really nothing in them that is of a sort that would, I think, warrant a family sitting on them and not allowing reasonable access. But we may want to talk about that later if that would interest people. But I think it gives a vivid insight into his personality and his workload as Prime Minister. Now, some people have suggested that serious historians shouldn't write biography. Biography is somehow a lesser form of historical genre. Now, strictly, this isn't a biography attempting a detailed account of all aspects of Nehru's life from birth to death. The title of Nehru, A Political Life, is a play on words. It's an account of his political life rather than a biography. But it also indicates that I think that his life was one consumed by politics. Now, the intention is to try to understand what motivated, what fired Nehru, what sustained him during the demanding, turbulent, and often very uncomfortable career in politics. His ideals, his webs of connections with a whole range of people, his key relationships, and his opportunities in the particular circumstances of the British Raj and its ending. And then the last part of the book says what did he make of these opportunities, what he hoped to do as Prime Minister particularly, and the extent to which he was able to follow his aims in the particular context of Indian society and politics. Now, though the biographical approach to history has its pitfalls, one can trivialize the wider events at the expense of focusing on an individual. One can pay far too much attention to the individual and his strengths and weaknesses. But despite all that, if you look at a significant and sensitive figure wrestling with big issues in a particular political and social context, it is actually very revealing of wider issues and larger scale historical trends. And what I've attempted to do is to try to see Nehru as a man of his generation amongst Asian politicians. He was obviously born in the final decades of the 19th century. In British terms, he was a Victorian, and he was the generation that saw immense transformation in their lives. A world marked by 2 world wars, a world changed by the ending of European imperialisms, and of course, a world massively changed by technology, not least the technologies of rapid communications. And I see him, I see Nehru and his travails and his interests and the issues he thought were important as somehow symptomatic of what a whole range of leaders of that generation had to deal with. And the format I adopted was 5 parts, looking at his life, and in each part, looking at what that tells us about a particular period in Indian politics and the sort of groundwork themes that were at work in Indian politics at the time. Now, I've tried to explain to you what I intended as I started out on the biography, because the bane of an author's life are reviewers who demand something else, something that you didn't actually set out to do. In my case, reviewers have complained about a number of things. Many of them have wanted far more gossip and much more in the way of revelations of a personal kind, particularly about Nehru's private life and his relations with key women. I think it was actually an American reviewer who said it was rather an austere book, by which I took that as a compliment and assumed it meant it wasn't full of tittle-tattle. Another set of interviewers have wanted a book which is basically about contemporary India, and particularly issues related to the rise of a Hindu nationalism of a very new kind, and have said that I completely missed an opportunity to discuss late 20th century India. Well, I'm awfully sorry if that's what you've come to hear me talk about. Please feel free to go, because actually the book is not about that. It is a book about Nehru's life. And so, of course, it ends in the mid-1960s, though many of the issues discussed have enormous relevance for the later 20th century. Now, let me very briefly share with you, before we enter into conversation, the things that have really interested me about Nehru or surprised me. The first thing, I think, is having the privilege to work in the private papers of a man as they were accumulated day by day during the work of Prime Minister. You keep company. I kept company in a very intimate way with him, living through crises, living through daily routines of work. And he seems to me to have been a man driven by a sense of obligation and vocation, wanting to create a new India in the aftermath of imperialism. There's a poignant passage in a prison diary written. He kept a copious prison diary in the many months he spent in British jails. And at the very end of his last sentence, late 44 or early 1945, he mused that he was feeling tired and getting on in years. And he said, "Is it ever going to be given to me to have the time to pursue the great visions that I have always wanted to pursue?" And of course, the time was given to him. He came out of prison in 1945 and was at the very apex of Indian politics till his death in 1964. And I think there was this vision and a sense of obligation which sustained him throughout these years. It taxed his physique, it taxed his psyche to the absolute limit. But he was a person who rose to challenges. He was a person actually who enjoyed wielding power. Not power, I think, for its own sake, but for what power could actually do. And he was sensitive enough to realize the dangers of the sort of power that his position as Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy, what the power that had given him. And in fact, during the years of the nationalist movement, he had slightly slyly written an anonymous article about himself in an Indian English language journal, where he had pointed out that this young and somewhat glamorous nationalist politician was actually a danger, because he was able to wield such a popular appeal. He drew crowds, and it reminded his compatriots that they ought to watch this man because he was capable of dictatorship. It was only later that he admitted that he himself had written this article about himself. But I think it shows something of the way he understood what power could do to people. He was at times capable of extreme explosions of anger because I think he thought that he knew best, and that so many of the people around him were somehow perverted by wanting to pursue their own selfish goals. And one of his Congress colleagues said to him, "You know, you talk about giants and pygmies, and this is scary because, you know, you make people feel that they are pygmies." But I think despite this, he was also a deeply attractive and to some a very compelling man. And we only have to read the accounts of people who worked for him to know how, even to the point, I think, of danger, people felt that he was somehow, he knew best, he was the father of India, and were very reluctant to be critical of him. Now, quite obviously, for such a man, life could be a very lonely business, and I think that he was, despite the fact that he was always at the heart of public life, always surrounded by crowds, he was at heart a very deeply lonely man. So his personality has been something I've found fascinating. Also, his ideology. I think was a man who was very difficult to pigeonhole ideologically. So much of his intellectual formation was, of course, Western. As a young boy, he was sent, first of all, he had a Western tutor at home. Then he was sent to Harrow, where he endured the rigors of an English public school. He then went on to Trinity College, Cambridge, before studying for the bar in London. Not only, of course, did he read during this time and later, but he also, I think, was a man of genuine intellectual dialogue. And he also took from a range of Indian sources inspiration as well, not least, of course, under the tutelage of Gandhi. And I think he was immensely creative intellectually. Perhaps some people wouldn't think of him as an intellectual as such, but he was certainly a thinker, if somewhat pragmatic thinker. And one of the most interesting things about him was, I think, his very specific construction of an Indian idea of socialism. He always maintained that one could never take an ism or an ideology from anywhere, not even from the Western canon. But one had to take it, learn from it, and then reformulate it as something which spoke to and worked for Indians. And by the time that he was Prime Minister in the early 1950s, he'd left behind anything in the way of dogmatic or doctrinaire socialism. And he believed that India was engaged in a unique experiment of broad spectrum socio-economic development within a democratic framework. And he kept saying, you know, this is a unique experiment. We are the first country to engage in a major reconstruction, but not by force. So we don't have the time that some Western democracies had to engage in this sort of development. But we cannot go down the route of the USSR or of China. And interestingly, one of the things he drew on for an example was the way Britain had tried to reconstruct itself after the Second World War in a democratic framework. But he drew on his Western reading, he drew on the example of Gandhian ideals, on his experience of Russia, and of his experience of Britain. Or again, creatively, one has to think back in time to what it must have been like in the 1950s, but I think that his vision of a world order coming out of the end of Western imperialism, where newly independent states would not be aligned to either bloc in the Cold War, was in fact a huge ideological leap of vision for that period. Now, those of us who are immersed in the histories of colonialism and the world after empire, and those of us who are interested in the new nations of the world, wrestle with the nature of the nation. And of course, Nehru did as well. And this is another of the big issues that I found so interesting, looking at it through his eyes. What was the Indian nation? What constituted it? And why was the Indian subcontinent fractured in 1947, when so many people had felt that the subcontinent was going forward to a united freedom. And of course, this is an issue that has gone on and on and on into the present day. Who belongs to the Indian nation? Who is excluded from it? Now, Nehru's vision of India drew on a number of sources, a deepening appreciation, I think, of the depth and diversity of Indian civilization as he worked with Gandhi and as he responded to Gandhi's influence. He also had a vision of India as a nation, as a modern nation, as a culture and a people who needed the nation state as a modern political construction, essential for the protection and expression of national identity. And of course, I think he believed that India's diversity demanded above all the conscious construction of a nation above region, above language, above religion. And we have to remember that for his generation, people who had worked in the nationalist movement and then saw the devastation that hit northern India in 1947, people like him became even more convinced of the need for a secular national identity, which of course his own intellectual formation had presupposed. And of course one of the issues which is so problematic over Nehru is how somebody who'd been brought up to believe that religion had no place in nationalism, who consciously believed that a religious nationalism was medieval, and he actually used that term, how somebody like that could speak to a diverse India and could actually engage, particularly with Hindus, who said, no, the Indian nation rests on fundamentally Hindu culture. And this, I'm sure, is something that we want to talk about. But I believe that his background, particularly his somewhat secular Western background and upbringing, made him far less sensitive to the deep fears of many people in India at the time, particularly those who fled and tried to escape from the violence of partition. And in many ways, unlike Gandhi, his great mentor, he didn't have a language to express Indian nationality, except in frankly modern and secular terms. And it's this, in fact, which is so much at issue today, whether in fact he spoke in a language which is really outmoded and which can say nothing to India at the start of the 21st century. If we go on to when Nehru was Prime Minister, there are just two things I would like to mark out as things that really grabbed my attention when I was writing this book. The first was the way he molded the office of Prime Minister. I think when one thinks about nationalist leaders who inherit power from a colonial regime, one tends to forget that actually they don't have a sense of or a structure of office and a pattern of operating as a democratic leader as you do if you inherit power in a British or American or French system. If you become British Prime Minister, you know what's expected of you and you have a structure within which you learn to work. But of course Nehru had to work out from the beginning what an Indian Prime Minister would be like and how he or she would behave. I think one of the most interesting things is that though we think of Nehru as somehow a democrat, one of the things that he really wanted to do when he was at the point of taking office was to have a very powerful personal office, a Prime Minister's office, very much like the one that the Prime Minister in India has today. Now, the outgoing Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, who was 10 years younger than Nehru, but was something of an advisor to him at this stage, he absolutely tried to put a stop to that. And Nehru didn't, as a result, have the sort of powerful personal office that he wanted. but I think it was symbolic of how things would move. And even though he didn't have that, he exercised a personal dominance in the government, and particularly in the cabinet, and treated his colleagues in ways which Mountbatten said that even Churchill, at the height of his powers, would not have dared to do within the British system. Now, the personal dominance of the government was partly because of his own personal standing and the fact that he had in fact inherited Gandhi's mantle, particularly after Gandhi's assassination in 1948. But Nehru also combined an extraordinary range of offices which would make any contemporary politician blench. He was Prime Minister, and if that wasn't enough, he was his own Minister for External Affairs for the whole time that he was Prime Minister. And also for a significant number of years, he was President of the Indian National Congress. Now, I mean, that is a mind-blowing workload. Perhaps not surprisingly, when he was absent from India, much of the business of central government virtually stopped. Or again, we see his repercussions in 1962 and afterwards when he was ill, terminally ill, and he refused either to step down or to have a deputy. Now, perhaps it was partly this enormity of the office or partly his own personality, but he paid an enormous attention to detail. He was, if you read through the daily workload that came over his desk, he dealt with an amazing number of things. He could not delegate the non-essentials or the lesser things to significant people in his government. And of course, people around him traded on this fact, and they said, well, you know, we must get the Prime Minister to do this, because if he says this, if he says so, then it will be done. And I was just amazed to find that he spent time designing the uniforms for the Foreign Service and what they should wear on formal occasions, the decor of India's foreign missions, whether or not alcohol should be served in parties. Or again, and I quote this in the book, something that caught my eye particularly, some of the early Air India advertising was perhaps slightly less, I don't know quite what the word is. One parent of an Indian Air India hostess found the advertising somewhat risque and wrote to the Prime Minister in great anger that his daughter should be seen in this light in an advertisement. And he writes to the Minister for Aviation and says, this must stop. This isn't worthy of our national airline. Now, that the Prime Minister should get involved in something like that is actually not an economical use of prime ministerial time. But it showed the incredible determination and investment of effort and time that Nehru put into being Prime Minister. But of course, to set up a pattern where somebody is so dominant in office and so unable to delegate can have huge repercussions. And of course, Nehru's daughter was nearest to him in place and in time. She watched how he was Prime Minister, and some of his trends she took to an even greater extent. The other thing in his prime ministerial capacity that I found really very tragic was his increasing ambiguity towards the Indian National Congress, the party that had brought India to independence and brought him to power. And he became increasingly ill at ease within the Congress, made up as it was of so many different regional groups who often had their own particular agendas. And instead of actually throwing himself into the business of managing Congress and seeing that this was part and parcel of being Prime Minister, he took refuge, I think, in the myth of a golden age. He kept harking back as if there had been a golden age of Congress unity and Congress loyalty to the nation and to Gandhi. And of course, those of us who've been through his papers and through the history of his relationship with Congress before 1947 know very well that he had a very uncomfortable time within it, and that Congress was often rent with division, even before 1947. So I think you have here an aging Prime Minister taking refuge in a mythological past of the party without really getting to grips to what the relationship of the Prime Minister should be to the party and the party leaderships in the states. And of course, those of you who know much about Indira Gandhi's reign as Prime Minister will know that, again, this is a problem that comes to the fore in the 1970s and early 80s. And then the last thing that really grabbed my notice from his prime ministerial role was his amazing world standing. Rapidly, after 47, he became a world figure of standing and leverage, who many different states and state leaderships needed to deal with. In the UK, in the eyes of the UK government, he became a major figure within the newly constructed Commonwealth, and he was, of course, part of the process which in 1949 enabled India to remain as a republic within the Commonwealth and transformed the Commonwealth into a much wider community of nations. Nehru became, within the Commonwealth, a link figure between the former imperial power and many other states. Particularly, you can see this role during the Suez Crisis. And the United States, and this was one of the things that I gained particularly in my work here in the library, was the way that successive administrations strove to understand him and to fashion productive relationships with Nehru, because they saw him as, to some extent anyway, a bulwark against the spread of communism in Asia, even though successive administrations often found his non-aligned stance perplexing and at times annoying. And I think that American politicians felt in many ways that Nehru was culturally hostile to America. And I think there is an element in that. I get the sense that he felt very much more at home in Britain and with the British establishment than he ever did when visiting Washington or New York. And of course, both the British government and the American government, I think, felt that he was an important figure to deal with because of his role within the non-aligned movement. But the non-aligned movement for itself found him not only a powerful spokesman, but also somebody who was potentially dominant. And the records of the Bandung Conference suggest that there were many Asian leaders who were extremely restless at the way that Nehru tried to assert dominance. Now, I think I've almost said enough about why I wrote the book. I'd just like to end by saying something about how I feel about his achievements and failures. Obviously, there's an immense raft of achievements to his name. I mean, the fact that he was able to help India through a time of potential disruption and instability after the withdrawal of the British, that he was able to help cement the unity of India and the stability of a democratic polity. And the fact that his succession was managed within a week after he died with no disruption to the polity at all was profound evidence of his legacy in this respect. I think, too, that despite his concerns with Congress, despite all his weaknesses in being able to address ideas of the nation in any other language other than the language of European and American nationalism, he was still able to act as a figurehead for a new sense of Indian unity and identity, which were founded on a whole set of positive ideals and plans, rather than on just the negative of the common enemy, the negative of the enemy of the imperial ruler. And I think that Nehru actually set standards of impeccable probity and honesty in public life, partly because of his background in family and education, and largely because of his association with Gandhi. He was absolutely adamant that he should not be in public life for his own profit or benefit. And though often this ideal is now honoured in the breach in India, as in many other countries, there is still this idea that the early nationalists, when they came to power after 1947, set an ideal of politicians working for the whole people rather than for a segment or a section of the population. But obviously, too, there were immense failures of policy and even more failures of implementation. One can debate the strategy of development that Nehru's government started, the late recognition that population was going to be a major issue for India, the lamentable disregard of primary education for all Indians. And we can see not just the failures of vision here, but the fact that Nehru in Delhi was constrained by the nature of the polity which was set up at the end of British rule, that the power of the states which made up the Union of India actually put power into the hands of local politicians who had priorities other than those of the whole country and its peoples. And of course there was the real problem which Nehru didn't recognize, a precedent set by his own dominance of central government and his failure to fashion a prime minister's role which was built on a set of regional relationships. A problem, I think, which was masked to an extent by his own standing in Congress, but came back to haunt the Congress after his death, and particularly during his daughter's tenure of office. But having said that, having hinted at some of the real problems that Nehru left behind, as well as the things that he helped to construct, I'd have to say that writing this book has been enormously exciting, a historian handling marvelous primary sources. And it's also been a privilege to keep company through the sources with a very remarkable man of vision and vocation. He still, if you read him, if you try to understand him, he still has the power to challenge, to irritate, but you come away with an overwhelming sense of a man of immense energy and commitment who put individual comfort and ease and any possible normal social life aside in the service of a far greater ideal. So maybe we could now begin.
I'm very grateful indeed for this opportunity to be at this gathering. I checked on the online catalog, Prosser, to see how many lives of Nehru you have. You have 145. Now, I've not read all the 145, nor I doubt if Judith has read all them, but I have read all the good ones. And I'm going to say and make the claim that Judith's book is easily the best of the biographies. She's very generous towards the others in her book, as she was today in speaking of Escopals. But Judith's is the first biography of Nehru that has gone beyond chronology and gone beyond hagiography and written a kind of book about a man who had an extraordinary influence. Now, I want to stress that Judith's book is not like Attenborough's film of Gandhi, where there is one figure surrounded by pygmies, and students love Attenborough's film. There's a great hero and so on. Judith's book is a very complicated book in many ways. And I just want to touch upon one or two things and hope she will comment. Anybody who knows the material could spend many hours just discussing a point. I'm going to mention just one point. One thing that has always troubled me, and I've been reading more about it recently, sorry, and that is 1946, when some of us believed there was a real moment of an undivided India. The cabinet mission came out from England, and I like very much the way that you quoted what Wavell called them, the Magi, and Patel called them the great men. Very important figures. It was extraordinary who these people were that came out to try to work out a transfer of power, something that had never been done before in history. And it's fascinating to watch it. And the question I hope Judith will comment on, some of us reading this material feel that this was Nehru's great failure in those days when it might have been possible to have an undivided India, to transfer power to a single entity. And some of us reading that see that, at least the way some of us read it, is that it was Nehru who prevented this transfer of power to a single entity because of his dislike of Jinnah, his failure to understand, I think, what was happening in the country, and perhaps what Judith touched upon, Nehru's sense of being a great man, his sense of power. And so what happened, looking back, is partition. The other thing I would like Judith to comment on is this business of Nehru's relationship with Jinnah, and the whole question of Jinnah's understanding of the role of religion in society. Now, all of us who read about Nehru know some of his views of religion. He thought religion, often said it, was a superstition. He berated politicians who gave great deference to religion. And I was thinking when I was reading them just the other day, when he was speaking of people who believed in religious superstition and so on, how I wish there was a Nehru to speak about religion in this country, the way Nehru had the courage to speak about religion in India, to speak of it as a drag on social change, on a force that prevented change taking place, who spoke of religion as a force that stood for all that was regressive in society. And as I say, how I would enjoy hearing somebody speak that way in our own American society. But there's the other side of Nehru, and that is his relationship with Gandhi and Gandhi's ideas. And I just want to say a word about that and hope that Judith will say something about him. The heart of this, as I read her book, is in the section on Nehru's vision of India, and I'm trying to think, it's chapter 15 called A New India, in the section Frustrations of Vision, from 1957 to 1964. And I think this is why I think this is the best book yet written on Nehru, that she gets to the heart of Nehru as a figure with extraordinary power, who had an extraordinary hold on the Indian people, and yet she speaks of Nehru's failures as well as his successes. And she enumerates a number of them. One was the failure to create an educational system in India. Now, we all know how Indians run the high-tech world, and in this country, the medical world, a whole range of things. But the masses of Indians were left without a system of education. She speaks of other things, the failure to encourage small-scale industries, the failure to reform the administration from its imperial mold, which had been an administration created to give order and stability. And that was surely the British greatest achievement, was to give order and stability to India. But order and stability was not what India needed. Now, Judith's book has a good deal on this. She also has a good deal on the extremely interesting question of Nehru's relationship with China, why he failed to understand what was happening. Now, what I got out of Judith's book, and I hasten to add that my view is that once a writer publishes a book, it's no longer her book, it belongs to the readers, and we will make of it what we choose. And what I made of Judith's book at this time is a confirmation of my own sense that while Nehru spoke a great deal about science, about what we might call social engineering and so on, that at the heart of this extraordinary man and his relationship with Gandhi was Gandhi's vision that social change would come about through inward moral regeneration. That back of all the great 5-year plans, and why I think Nehru did fail in many of these great plans, was that ultimately he held to Nehru's vision that social change would come about through moral regeneration of the people, as Gandhi profoundly believed. Again, I will take Judith's word for this. Her books on Gandhi are the best books on Gandhi as well. What Nehru was talking about, his vision of a new India, of a world of social engineering, could not be accomplished by moral regeneration. What he was talking about was a kind of change that would have needed something of the Russian model, something of the Chinese model. And yet ultimately, what he depended upon was this sense of a kind of moral inward change. Judith spoke of the way he treated his cabinet members, the way he wrote to the governors of the province and the chief ministers, very often like a rather angry schoolmaster checking in on the boys. But back of it, I think, was this sense of seeking moral regeneration and perhaps not seeing that the kind of India that he needed a degree of compulsion as well as the appeal. Nehru was a marvelous writer, and he does make these stirring appeals, but one feels that they are not going to go anywhere. Now, in the very last pages of her book, Judith says that at the end of his life, Nehru came closer to Gandhi and his teaching, and perhaps he realized why there was failure within the Indian system. She said Nehru found no cultural idiom to enunciate his visions of the relationship of religion to political life. He could only enunciate that in terms of secularism, which those of us who lived in India in those years, in 48, 58, admired Nehru enormously for his emphasis on secularism, by which he meant more than just freedom of religion. Red Austin has a great quote in his book. I wrote it down if I can find it. Nehru was writing to the Congress leaders, and he told them secularism meant more than the free play of all religions. It conveys the idea of social and political equality. In other words, secularism was not in our American sense of separation of church and state. He was talking about a way of life, social and political equality. In other words, he was confronting head-on Indian civilization, Indian culture, without, as she has put it, a cultural idiom to express it. Whereas, of course, Gandhi did have a cultural idiom. Gandhi had the cultural idiom of nonviolence, of moral regeneration. And as I read Judith's book, I learned many things from it. But I got this sense of she moved to a very profound insight into modern India. She disowned correctly any attempt to talk about Hindu nationalism and so on. But I think that you're moving towards this whole question of what, and I will steal your phrase, a cultural idiom. And that's what Gandhi had, was a cultural idiom, and what Nehru lacked. And I would love to hear what you say on either of these comments.
Whatever you like. Well, it's sort of hard to follow. You want to use that if you speak to that. It's sort of hard to follow these distinguished acts that preceded. But my first note here is that it is the best biography to date. So we're all agreed about that. I hope you are. The one thing that I do regret, I noticed the absence of Hiren Mukherjee. He's not mentioned in the book, he's not mentioned in the bibliography. And in 1964, this man who was the statesman of the Communist Party of India wrote a book about Nehru called The Gentle Colossus. And I think he and Nehru were extraordinarily fond of each other, and they could talk serious subjects and they could disagree. That's the only thing, I think, in your book that I missed. I really hate to say how good the book is before you, because in public, because it might damage your character in some way. But, oh, is it? All right. Okay. Biographies have been written, as everybody here has pointed out, and Prosser did by beginning, and you would have thought that everything had been said about Nehru, and then someone comes along and you find that everything hasn't been said about Nehru. And Judith is the most important of that. And I think the construction of the book keeps it clear. I think the first chapter of the book is a masterful presentation of context. Nehru is seen almost as one-dimensional, one dimension many times, single-dimensional. But he wasn't. He was a product of all the things that you write about. But he was the product, I mean, not only in his personal life, but he was the product of the world he inherited in India. What were the economic and social things moving? And then one of the other great parts of her book, I believe, is that she knits together all the sources, and they are vast if you look at her notes. But then she lets Nehru speak for himself. And he's fully capable of doing so. And we who try to absorb what he said, learn from it. Nehru also, for those who don't look at him in one dimension, see him as two. They see him in two pieces, the man before independence and the prime minister. But here again, Judith brings them together. I think her critique of his mistakes, misapprehensions, omissions, and whatnot, and her placing of these omissions in context are very, very important. And the lack of primary, of his push on primary education is particularly serious, but he got lost in his pursuit of higher education because he thought that this was necessary for the country to move ahead rapidly in development. And so he focused on the one, and we've seen the result in Indian scientists and technology people today, but he didn't look didn't look at all really at primary education. And at times he was absolutely conflicted about the intellectual capability of people in the villages. And when it came to extending panchayats into the village and so forth, he and people in the Constituent Assembly and in the general atmosphere of the time said not just critical things, but things that were misapprehensions. I don't think he ever understood in many ways, intellectually, emotionally maybe he did, but intellectually didn't understand the vast undeveloped, not just underdeveloped, but undeveloped talent of the Indian citizen, the Indian person, and whatnot. There are a couple of things she said here that pleased me so much that I'd like to read a couple of them out, if you'll forgive me. And if you won't, you have to listen anyway. One of its most significant themes, significant intellectually and for an understanding of Nehru's vision of India after independence, is his realization that India, in quotes, had emerged over time with a richness rooted in layer upon layer of cultural influences and changes, which would in turn give it the strength to continue adapting to the challenges of the modern world. Here was no static nation, but one which could grow by creative change. Now, I find this not in contradiction of his understanding of the mental capabilities of villagers, but his view of the whole India and where it came from, and this is its, his view of its psychology and of its, richness. And I myself am an adherent of the view that India's strength lies in its diversity. And those who believe its greatness stems from a Hindu tradition, scriptures great in their cultural, religious, and intellectual quality, but they are not the foundation upon which a nation can be based. And another thing here, he wondered if he had a big role to play in the future. Vanity says yes, and reason says no. You are too squeamish, idealistic, proud, unbending, and aloof, and in any event, totally unfitted for political game. You do not represent India or the average Indian. You cannot walk in step with the West. It is your fate to fall between the two, which is a wonderful revelation, I think, of self-knowledge. There are details, if you call them that, maybe we shouldn't, that Judith has in her books, the effect that are very revealing and important for us to understand as we try to understand Nehru and as we try to understand India. The effect of imperial society and its behavior upon Indians thinking about themselves. Do we copy? Do we not copy? Nehru and Motilal, his father, had lessened ability to understand the masses. So when they came up against the fact that Congress, as a mass national party, trying to build a mass movement, they were rather startled, often I think dismayed, when they found that local identity took over and the national movement took on local colorations. This may have distorted it. It certainly took it away from the singularity that Nehru wished for. I think her treatment of the prison experiences and their shaping effects on Nehru is very, very strong and very powerful. Something that is in the book when she talks about the development in India and the issue of social reform creating turbulence is something that I think is very, very important. And at one time, he was up against the Congress Working Committee, who came out with the slogan, sort of, that Congress should not change India by way of class war. This, I think, had a profound influence on his daughter, Indira, when she was prime minister. She was quite worried about this, although she also used it as a diversion from her basic unwillingness to go hard for social reform. The tradition versus the reinvention of India, you both have talked about, and well, I think. And the conviction, Nehru's conviction and unease regarding his own first principles. He was a Democrat, but he had an imperial style of pushing through reform because he believed it was needed and it was good. And therefore, as you said, some compulsion was necessary in his view. Like Havel, although much greater than Havel, I think, Nehru showed us that an intelligent man can be a great national leader and govern a country. There are strange things about Nehru's understanding. Judith points out very well in her book that when they went into the countryside, he was thrilled to be with the peasants, not only their adoration, but he felt he was with real people. But yet, in 1953, when he took a tour of the Punjab, and therefore he knew a lot about the Talukdars. The Talukdars were the traditional landlords in the countryside in North India, or Bihar and eastern UP. And he knew what the Talukdars could do in the way of economic mistreatment of the peasants, rack renting, cesses, and all that sort of thing. Yet, when Nehru took a trip to the Punjab in 1953, he wrote in one of his letters that he was astounded that tenants were still being evicted. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, what the hell did he expect? So there were these queer, what would I call them? Queer isn't quite the right word. Disjunctions in some of his thinking. I'd like to mention a couple of things, partly out of my personal experience, and I hope I'm not going on too long, that were brought up or brought to my mind by things that both Ainsley and Judith said. Both individuals superior to me in their knowledge of India, I think. Nevertheless, Nehru was tough on his cabinet ministers. He had fights with his finance minister, and when his finance minister Deshmukh would quit, he worked very hard to bring him back because he knew that he needed him. The First Amendment to the Indian Constitution had a great deal to do with socialism, property, social reform in its largest sense. But the processing of that amendment and its drafting, I've gone through the file, and the file is this thick. Minister was writing to minister. Secretary of government was writing to secretary of government. This will work, that won't work. Why are you doing it this way, that way? Struck me as cabinet government at its most open and effective. Now, Nehru was at the top of the pyramid, but all this preparation went on under him, and he was aware of it and fed on it. Omniscient he may have thought he was. No, he didn't think. Powerful he thought he was, but he didn't think he was omniscient, in my view. Finally, and has his attention to detail. This is a terribly personal anecdote, but I can tell it anyway. When I was in India in 1960, beginning research on that first book in its orange cover, which unfortunately is saffron, the color of the Hindu nationalists, which isn't really pleasing to me, but there it is. I'd gone through lots of archives. I'd got them all microfilmed at my expense in the Indian National Archives, and I had a wealth of material, largely by luck, circumstance, some by persistence in digging, but largely by luck. And I had learned that there was an archive from the Constituent Assembly in the Law Ministry. When the Constituent Assembly was broken up, it ended its work, its papers and whatnot went in all different directions, some held by individuals, including the President of India, Prasad, and whatnot. But one of these archives went to the Law Ministry, but the Law Secretary wouldn't let me in. So I wrote to Nehru, and at that time, let's see, when was that? That was 1960. I was, I guess, 33 years old. So this young sprout writes to the Prime Minister of India and says, "Sir, I'm having trouble. I know you're busy running a country, but this is my problem." And he wrote on the margin of that letter, "Help this man." The gates were opened. I mean, that may be too much attention to detail, but I'm all for it. Finally, I'd like to say a word about the so-called revisionists. Without using that name, I think Judith mentioned them in terms of, rethinking about Nehru these days in Delhi. I don't know entirely what this comes from, but some of it comes from their lack of understanding of the context. They should read your book. Particularly, they don't understand how, in terms of economic and social development, Nehru was not only a creature of his time, but he was a creature of his situation. And therefore, he moved in certain ways that are not difficult to understand. And he began to move away from those a decade later, when he began to see weaknesses in some of his thoughts. But I think the people who maybe they don't demean Nehru, maybe they just lack sufficient understanding and appreciation. I think Ainsley's raised very good questions about this, and so has Judith. But I think Nehru's legacy is representative government in India. I think only two individuals at that time, 1947 onward, could have held India together and made it into a nation. And they were Sardar Patel, who died in December 1950, leaving the stage to Nehru, and Nehru himself. And I don't think we would have the India today anywhere near if Nehru hadn't lived to guide it as best he could until 1964. Thank you.
Well, my first response should be of thanks for such marvellous comments, and just the wish that there was more time for people just to sit down and talk together. It sounds a crazy thing to say, but actually in academic life one spends so much time doing other things that just sitting down with other scholars and talking about big issues like this so rarely happens. I don't think that Red actually posed any questions for me to tackle head on, but there are 2 or 3 things that I'd just like to pick up on. You mentioned his intellectual rapport with Hiran Mukherjee. I think one of the interesting things about Nehru was that he was a man who thrived actually on discussion and on being able to talk things through with people. And one of the problems when he came to be Prime Minister that there were very few of those around that he felt he could trust really to talk with and bash things out with. I think one of the reasons that so many of his closest interlocutors were foreign were because he felt they were safe. They wouldn't come back at him in Indian politics. There's another name which perhaps we should mention, and that is Krishna Menon, because he too was someone that's pretty well on the left of politics, who Nehru first met in London in the 1930s, who was quite outside the, didn't come to any sort of prominence within the Congress. He wasn't a career politician at all within India. And Nehru stuck with him right through to the disaster of the Chinese invasion in 1962. I think partly because he felt that he was, at some level, a kindred spirit, a thoughtful man, a powerful intellect who he could actually talk with. And I think this is something that I touched on, the loneliness of Nehru, but it's something that could perhaps be one could talk about more fruitfully and more fully.
And that is that in 1953 or 54, oh, sorry. In 1953 or 1954, he wrote letters to G.B. Pont, who was Chief Minister of UP, and some others who had been in the independence movement with him and were the great stalwart leaders of states in India, and said, we old chaps have got to get together. Now let's set up some meetings and talk this through. I miss you. And I miss what you can give me and what we can share together. I found that really quite moving. Here was not only a lonely man, but a lonely statesman.
Yeah. But they never did, as far as I know. They never set up those meetings.
I think maybe not.
No. The other thing that you touched on, sort of in the middle of what we're talking about, was his failure perhaps to understand the talent available within particularly the Indian countryside. He was always the paternalist, the father figure, whatever he said about being a Democrat. And I think there is a real truth in this. One has to remember the stable out of which he came. He came from a family not of wealthy aristocrats. His father had made good in the legal profession and become one of the wealthiest and most successful lawyers in India. His legal practice was actually based on inheritance law amongst some of the great landowners of northern India. So it was an extraordinarily lucrative practice. And it was this that sent Nehru on his way to education in Britain. Now, these were people who thought of them, it was a family that came to think of itself and its friends as inherently superior, not by birth, but by achievement and by intellectual achievement and professional achievement. And the family was westernized and wealthy to an extent undreamed of by most Indians. I mean, the Indianist present, please forgive me, but I mean, you'll know that Nehru Sr., Motilal, moved into the white part of town in Allahabad, which was a large city in the United Provinces north of Delhi, in a time when most Indians couldn't conceive of living in that part of an urban area. He bought a large house. He had stables, 2 kitchens, a swimming pool, a riding ring for the children to learn riding in. He was able not just to have a tutor and Western governesses for his daughters, but to send his child to boarding school in Britain and then to Cambridge. All, of course, paid for by Papa's earnings. And there was a sort of superiority that grew up amongst the males and to an extent the females in this family, that they were a new breed of Indians. They were the standard bearers of a new India. And it was an immensely privileged upbringing, but it also bred a sense of, to those to whom privilege has been given, from them shall much be required. And I think he had this enormous sense of obligation. But that did feed into a sort of paternalistic view of his role. Now, towards the end of his life, I think he became deeply dispirited about the failures of reform from above, particularly social reform. And he began to say the real reform will only come from the roots upwards, as it were, much more Gandhian vision of what would really be the motors of serious socio-economic change. Now that, I think, takes me naturally to the issues about religion that Ainsley raised. You have to understand the background in which Nehru was brought up, I think, to understand his attitude to religion. That in his household, religion was seen as a woman's work. Now, I mean, obviously within the Hindu household, the women do the daily business of managing the family's Hindu identity. They tend the family shrine, they manage the kitchen and issues of purity and pollution to do with cooking and so forth. And in the Nehru household, the women had a Hindu kitchen, a kitchen whereas his mother and aunt and so forth and could maintain purity and pollution, cook vegetarian food, while the males brought into their sphere of the household a very westernized ethic. They used English amongst themselves, whereas the women used Hindi, and Nehru as a child would write in English to his father, but in Hindi to his mother. And the males of the household were all lawyers, and they brought that Western professional world into their household. Their friends were like-minded people in the same professions. And there's they observed no rules of purity and pollution, and they drank alcohol quite happily. In fact, there's a very funny story that Nehru was quite used to, Nehru as a child, baby Nehru, was quite used as a toddler, seeing his father drink champagne. That seemed to him quite normal. But when he first saw him drink claret, he had a real problem, because he thought it was blood, and he ran to his mother saying, "No, Dad is drinking blood," and had to be assured that this was actually red wine. But this was the sort of household in which Nehru was brought up. But more deeply than this, I mean, I think he believed that the practice of Hinduism as a set of rituals and understandings of purity and pollution were not modern. They were things from the past which India should do without, because they were creating divisions between Indians, and they were holding India back from major and necessary change. Another tiny example from his own family. When he was in prison in the early 1940s, his brother-in-law, greatly loved brother-in-law, Ranjit Pandit, died, leaving his sister, the older of the two Nehru girls, a widow. Now, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit only had daughters. The result was that she did not inherit anything of her husband's wealth, not his own personal wealth or any share in the joint family's wealth. If she had had a son, she would have inherited at least her husband's wealth in trust for the son. And Nehru in prison was desperate. There was nothing he could do for his sister except reassure her of whatever financial support he could give. Actually, what happened was that a Kashmiri colleague, a lawyer and friend, though at the complete opposite spectrum of the political system, took up the cause of Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. It became a cause célèbre, a sort of proto-feminist protest. And though she didn't win the court case, there was enough pressure to make a settlement out of court. And the father-in-law released Ranjit Pandit's own wealth for his widow and daughters. But for Nehru, this was the sort of thing that Hinduism particularly did. It held families back, it held women back. It was the antithesis of a proper modernity. And it was that, I think, that he was deeply hostile to, and deeply hostile to the way he felt that educated people and politicians could use religious identity and religious loyalty in order to create political followings for themselves, to create political fears and political movements which were divisive of India. Now, having said that, Nehru was not, I think, hostile to what I could only call a fundamental appreciation that men and women are spiritual beings. I think he saw that there was more to each of us than flesh and blood, than eating and drinking, than exercising power, or being professional in a career. It was Gandhi's passion for there being more than the material, more than what was actually to hand, the vision of a transformation that might be possible, which attracted Nehru to him. And even though he got very tangled up in his own mind about much of Gandhi's Hinduness, he was deeply concerned about the inner spiritual nature of mankind. And this came, I think, to the fore very late in his life, when he apparently went to talk regularly to the president about moral and spiritual issues. But you can see why this sort of a man felt that religion as practiced, the practice of religion, rather than religion as some underlying appreciation of the spiritual nature of man, why he hated what that might be doing to India, not just politically, but also socially. And it was this, I think, that led him to preach secularism in politics. That politics must be utterly separate from religion, because the divisiveness of religion would pull India back into a pre-modern era of conflict. Now, quite clearly, to many people, that sounded like an Englishman speaking, a westernized person speaking. And the joke was that people said about Nehru, of course, he's an Englishman, and at worst, he's an English gentleman. The absolutely worst possible combination. But I think he had a public image of being a radical, an angry young man, and bitterly anti-religion. And in fact, I think he was a radical, he was an angry young man, but he wasn't bitterly against the sort of underlying notion of religious meaning in life. But he was so anxious to stop the division of the Indian polity on lines of religion that, I mean, his great passion was to try by hook or by crook to achieve the unity of India at independence. Because if you remember, though Hindus are the vast majority in India, and were at the time of independence, Muslims were a very substantial minority. I forget the actual percentage, but I think it was about between 12 and 15% in India overall, but it varied from region to region. And the Indian population at independence was 350 million. So 12 to 15% is an awful lot of Muslims. There was in the Punjab a substantial Sikh population, and throughout parts of India, northwestern India and in southern India, there was a small but significant Christian minority as well. And I think that Nehru saw that the sort of logistics of public life in India meant that if India was to be a nation and to achieve a sense of unity, it had to be above those religious identities and to an extent leave them apart. Now, the rhetoric of secularism scared some, made some very anxious for India's cultural heritage, and of course was like a red rag to a bull for people like Jinnah. Now, the irony is that Jinnah was the same sort of person. He came out of the same sort of stable. Jinnah was a Muslim from Bombay, from a heterodox Muslim community. He was Western educated, a lawyer. He had absolutely no scruples about meat eating, about drinking alcohol. He was, I mean, the pity of it is, in a way, that he was so like Nehru. But for reasons which are very complex, he had come by the 40s to be the political leadership of a movement which, at least at a superficial level, demanded separation. Now, there's a lot of historical controversy about whether Jinnah really wanted a separate Pakistan as we know it. He was asking for a separate political identity for Muslims in the north and west. But how he expected to be able to separate Muslims out, interwoven as they were into so much of Indian society, is very difficult to imagine. And that's led many modern historians to think that really what he was arguing was Pakistan as a bargaining chip, if you like, in a game in a very subtle political game to achieve for Muslims, wherever they were in India, a mechanism for having a serious political voice as the democracy of numbers, the politics of numbers began to count. And of course, both Congress and the British, to an extent, called his bluff. Now, I don't know whether we should go into 1946 in detail. My own opinion is that Nehru's secularism and his demand for safeguards under that cabinet mission plan were as much actually Gandhi's doing as his. And I think the problem was this entangling of Muslims and Hindus in minorities and majorities in so many parts of India that if the Congress had agreed to all of the cabinet mission plan, it would have been seen as selling the pass to Hindus where they were in minorities. And it was the issue of the areas where Hindus were minorities that really created the stumbling blocks which led to the collapse of the cabinet mission plan. But I think that the comment that I think you made that I think is so important is that in the processes of decolonization, nobody had a script. Nobody knew what was going to happen. This was the first act of Western decolonization in Asia or Africa. When it came to African decolonization, and there are people in the audience who know much more about that than I do, I mean, there was, in a way, there were precedents. The Indian case had set up precedents, and nationalist movements knew that there were certain things the British would do or would not do, and certain types of politics that they accepted as legitimate or not. But the Indian case, Indian politicians were moving in the dark, just as in a sense the British were. And that again brings me back to the notion that Nehru was an enormously creative visionary who was actually able to work with the British as they departed.
It's now a little after 6 o'clock, and what I would suggest is the following. Those who feel that they have to leave are certainly at liberty to do so. Those who would like to go on and have an interchange with our speakers should certainly do that. Some members of the audience, I know, have an obligation at 6:30. I'll say a word about that in a minute because it's a little complicated, given the fact that there's a huge dinner in the Great Hall, which I'll say a little bit about also. But why don't we open it up to questions? And just to get things started, I want to ask a question about...
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.